talk about oligopoly. So here we are talking about few firms. The products can be same or different, right? What really characterizes oligopoly is few firms, and that is because of high barriers to entry. Not because the products are very different, they can be same as well. The key thing over here is that the barriers to entry are very high, and that's why there are few firms, few sellers and many buyers. And these sellers are large players. Think of credit card companies, oil producing companies, small number of sellers. Products could be same as well, doesn't have to be different. Think of cement or sugar. But because the investment in a cement plant or the investment in a sugar plant is so huge, or the investment in an oil production facility is exploration and then refining is so huge, that is significant barriers to entry due to the high cost, and therefore there are small number of sellers. Now, because of their low number, they have substantial pricing power, but their pricing decisions are interrelated, they are interdependent with each other. And that is why we're going to look at a lot of different strategies and theories regarding pricing in oligopolistic markets. And it could be that the products are differentiated. So a lot of marketing and features and non-price strategies could be there as well. But the most important part over here is the temptation to collude, because if they can get together and try to reduce the output and increase the price, then maybe they can maximize their profit, which might not be good for the people at large, but it will be good for the firms. And think of OPEC, right? The oil producing, exporting countries. They can reduce the output and increase the price, and therefore increase profitability for themselves, but it's not good for the oil importing countries. So within a country, obviously that's not allowed. There's competition commissions to stop that, to stop making of cartels. But at an international level, it's very hard to control, because firms would like to collude, act as a cartel, and maximize their profits. Now, there are various theories that we're going to discuss, several models that try to explain the pricing in oligopoly markets, especially if firms that are not colluding, then what will happen in terms of pricing. So the first one we're going to look at is the kinked demand curve, and this is usually very relevant for companies that are having an intense competition, right? So Coke and Pepsi is there, and let's say they are both currently priced at 100. Now if Pepsi increases their price or Coke increases their price, what will happen is that just for a little bit of price increase, let's say they increase from 100 to 105, only little bit they have increased the price, but look at the amount of quantity they will lose. So the demand curve above the kink is very, very elastic. Just a little bit of increase in price and a huge quantity reduction is there. So obviously nobody will want to increase their price. Why will they? Why will Coke want to increase price and lose market share to Pepsi? And neither of them will want to reduce price, because it's just going to be a loss for both, right? So what they'll do is they'll just stay at the kink. If Coke increases price from 100 to 105, naturally Pepsi is not going to follow, and Coke will lose a huge amount of business. And if both of them decide to decrease price, well, it's just going to be silly, because they're just going to give the benefit to the consumer and they will both reduce their profits. Now, in terms of your MC is equal to MR, MR is having a very interesting behavior over here, that it just splits in the middle. Because of this kink, what's happening is, because the elasticity is changing across the demand curve, your MR is changing in its slope. So from this point, it is up till A, it's here, and then suddenly it becomes a lot more steeper because your demand curve becomes a lot more steeper. So in the middle, you can assume that it's the same. The MR is the same, and whether your MC crosses it at this point or MC crosses it at this point, the quantity of 5000 is not going to change. So as long as the MC is crossing MR within this range, the quantity is not going to change, and therefore the price is also not going to change. For the firms to have any significant change in their price, there must be a significant change in the cost, right? The MC should change in a way that it either goes above the MR region over here or it goes below the MR region over here. As long as it is MC is within this region between A and B, the quantity, equilibrium quantity and price will not change. So the MC must change considerably for the firms to consider changing their price. So therefore, this model explains the stable prices. However, it does not tell us what the prices should be or how do we end up at the kink. But once you're at the kink, nobody wants to increase the price and there's no point reducing the price. How we get to the kink is something that the model doesn't explain. It's probably just that companies reduce their price and then they just realize that they're not getting anywhere, and then they stop reducing, they stop fighting, and then there's no point increasing from that point onwards, but there's no point reducing from that point onwards either, and that becomes the kink. Right, so now the Cournot assumption. So here what we are saying is that if you are changing your price as a firm, you're assuming that the other firm is not going to change. But obviously that's not true. So what happens is that in the long run, changing your price and quantity is not going to increase your profits, because the other firm obviously is going to make a change as well. And what happens is that as the number of firms increase in an oligopoly, the equilibrium points move closer and closer to perfect competition. And what that means is, and I'll demonstrate this on a chart, that if you see, this is, for your monopoly, that they will want to charge a very high price and a very low quantity to maximize their profit, right? And this is your Cournot price and your Cournot quantity, that it is going to be a lesser price and a higher quantity as more firms enter. And then as more firms enter even more, you're going to move towards a perfect competition price and a perfect competition quantity. So the point is that we cannot ignore the fact that there is strategic interdependence between firms. You are not operating in a silo. There are few firms. You cannot change your price and assume the other party or the other firm is not going to change their price. And that is where the Nash equilibrium comes in, that there is a lot of strategic interdependence between firms, and we have to take into account the actions of the other firms. And therefore, what we have to see is that what will be the different possibilities. And after taking into account all those possibilities, we arrive at an equilibrium where no firm then from that point onwards wants to change its strategy, because they will lose some of their profits. And to understand this, it's very good to see this box, where what's happening is that each of the firms will do what's best for them, right? And then what they will see is that they will come to this box, which is the highest profit what they can get, and then they don't want to move from that. Now this is assuming that they don't collude. If they collude, then they could even make more, and I'll demonstrate this right now. So let's say there could be these four possibilities, right? So there's Vesco and Rifco. They sell a similar product, and either you can go for a high price strategy or a low price strategy. If Vesco is going for a low price, they'll make a profit of 50. If Rifco is going for a low price, they'll make a profit of 70. However, if Vesco wants to go for a high price, they can get a profit of 500, and if Rifco goes for a high price as well, they can go for a profit of 300. So definitely it makes sense for them to go for a high price. But then Rifco might not be very happy with this situation because they're only making 300 while Vesco is making 500. So then Rifco might want to lower their price and go for this 350, in which case Vesco will only make 300. Now, what is to be noted over here is that what was the total profit in this box? 500 plus 300 is 800, whereas in this box it is only going to be 300 plus 350, which is 650. So as an industry, they were taking more money from the customers and making a total profit of 800 in this box. And it would have been better for them to just stay in that box and maybe share the profits in the sense that maybe Vesco could just give 100 to Rifco and they could both have 400 each. But they didn't do that. And here in Nash equilibrium, we're assuming that they are not going to collude. So what will happen is that Rifco will not be happy with the 300, whereas Vesco is earning 500. So they will decide to lower the price and go for the 350, and Vesco will then earn the 300, and then they will stay in this quadrant forever, and that is where the equilibrium is going to be, right? So this is demonstrated in various steps that, for example, you start off on the box left. Each of them is making very low money, so definitely they will want to increase the price. So what they do is that they increase the price, and then one of them starts making 500 and the other one starts making 300, but then again they will not be happy with it. Rifco will not be happy with it, and they will then move to the lower price, where then it will be 300 and 350. Obviously, what would have been better for them is that they, instead of landing up in box 4, they could have colluded and stayed here and gotten this 500 plus 300, which is obviously equal to 800, and they could have split that in terms of 400 each, where Vesco could have just transferred 100 to Rifco, and together they could have earned 400 each, which would have been more than what they're earning here. But assuming there is no collusion, they don't work together, and they are just independently taking their decisions, then of course they are going to end up in box 4 over here on the bottom left. If they do collude, then it will be said that they are forming a cartel, which is obviously illegal in many countries. So what are the factors that can enable successful collusions? Of course, you have to be few in number so that you can be able to coordinate easily. The product should be similar. Think of cement, sugar, and in many countries you will see that these cartels are there. Illegal nevertheless, but still there. Firms should have a similar cost structure. Orders should be small and frequent. There should be a low threat of retaliation from other firms, and the degree of external competition should be low so that the collusion attracts the overall profitability. All right, now the dominant firm model, or the Stackelberg model. Now here what happens in the oligopoly, that at least one of these firms is having a much lower price than everybody else. And I like to give the example of Aramco. So when we're talking about oil and gas production, Aramco is the Saudi Aramco, actually the whole name, it has a very low cost compared to all the other firms like BP and Shell and Exxon and Chevron. So naturally, it becomes the dominant firm. Now, what happens is that the leader firm will choose the price and the output level, and all the followers have to then follow it. Now, in terms of the supply analysis, the curriculum only discusses for the dominant firm part within oligopoly, right? And that is what we're going to look at over here in terms of its MC is equal to MR and how the equilibrium price is going to be calculated. So let's say there is one dominant firm with 40% market share. And let me demonstrate this on a chart. So what's happening over here is that the dotted line you see in terms of the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve, this is for the dotted line is for the dominant firm. Now, obviously the dominant firm is going to go for its MC is equal to MR, and it's going to produce this quantity. So this quantity is produced, let's say this is how much Saudi Aramco produces in terms of its oil production, right, at this price, and let's say that price is $100 per barrel. Now everybody else, which is this big demand curve, for the full industry, the industry is going to demand, let's say, 10 million barrels of oil, right? But Saudi Aramco is only producing 5 million. So this remaining 5 million is what Chevron and Exxon and Shell and everybody else is going to produce. So that is basically what's going on in the chart that you see here, that the interpretation is that the dashed lines are the dominant player. The dominant player will choose to produce here. This is the quantity it will produce. This is the price it will set. And at that price, this is the quantity for the full market. And the difference is basically going to be provided by the other firms. And the other firms have no interest in reducing the price further because they cannot compete with the cost of the dominant firms. If it does happen that the price does go down, then the other firms will just start to exit the business because they cannot sell below their cost, and the dominant firm's market share will just go up. Right. So what are the optimum price and output levels? Well, for the kink demand curves, just stay on the kink. Don't increase, don't decrease. For the dominant firm, you have to just follow the leader's price. For Cornell, again, it has to be at MC is equal to MR and then not to change from that point. And in the case of a Nash equilibrium, they will keep acting in their best interest until they get to that point where they cannot move for better. Right. And in terms of empirical evidence, what we have seen historically is that long-run economic profits are possible in oligopolies if you can collude or you can have some sort of strategy to have a nice pricing in place. However, it has been seen that the market share of the dominant firm does decline over time. And we have seen this in the oil market as well. Right. So determining the market structure. Now we're talking about looking at all of this from an analyst's perspective, that if you are looking at an industry, you're looking at a firm and it's in a certain industry and you want to figure out what market structure is this industry having. So how do you go about doing this, and what is the reason why you want to do it is obviously because you want to invest in firms which are in industries which are having market structures similar to oligopoly, because therefore they will have higher pricing power, which means they will be able to earn economic profits, positive economic profits in the long run. So you're looking for few large firms, low quantity supply, higher prices, and that's very good. But please keep in mind that what's best for the people, the consumers, is perfect competition, right? So the government is obviously not going to allow you to have oligopolies and monopolies. So what we have is something called an antitrust law or a competition law, which stops companies from becoming monopolies. And how do they go about doing that? There are multiple approaches. One is an econometric approach using a regression to see elasticity of demand. Now, what does that mean? If you have a flat demand curve like this, you can increase or decrease quantity, it makes no difference to the price. So that's good, that's perfect competition. But if you have a demand curve which is very steep like this, so if this is the price and this is the quantity, and let's say we're talking about the oil market, just a little bit reduction in the quantity and look at the big jump in the price, right? So let's say oil price goes from 50 to 150 just because OPEC decides to reduce the quantity a little bit. So one way of identifying what's happening in terms of an industry having a very inelastic demand, which means the company has or the companies have a lot of pricing power, market power. This is not good for the customers, so the government will try to control this. The disadvantage is that even though this model is theoretically appealing, it's not possible to do that easily, this type of complicated econometric modeling. So therefore we come to two simpler versions which are practical and used by regulators a lot. One is the N-firm concentration ratio, and the better one over here is the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. Before we go into the HHI, let's talk about the N-firm concentration ratio first. So N-firm concentration ratio is very straightforward. You just take, let's say if N is 5, so if we are taking the 5 largest firms, we'll just take their market shares and we'll add them, right? So it will be 25 plus 15 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10, which is going to give you 70%. Now it's very easy to calculate, but it doesn't really give us very good perspective into what it means. So even though the data is easily available and simple to use and understand, those are the advantages, but the disadvantages are that it is unaffected by mergers. So again, taking the same data, let's say that the top 2 firms merge and you have this huge firm which is 40%, and obviously this spot for the 5th one opens up and there's a small firm that comes in with 2%. So now the total goes from 70 to 72. It hasn't really changed that much, right? It's just a little bit increased. But what you are missing over here is that this big 40% market share firm that is there now, which we are ignoring, because if we are looking just at this 70 and 72%, we're missing out on how 2 firms which have come together are now a very big firm. So it does not quantify market power, and it also doesn't consider the elasticity of demand or the barriers to entry. Now, the HHI doesn't solve all those problems, but it does solve some of them, especially the one related to knowing about the impact of mergers and acquisitions at the top. Is that the way it is calculated is it takes, let's say if we're talking about N largest firms, and in this case the 4 largest firms, we'll take their market shares and we'll square them and add them. And the beautiful thing about the HHI index is that it is going to be ranging from 0 to 1. So it gives you a very quantitative perspective in terms of how concentrated the industry is getting, with 1 close to 1 indicating very high concentration or even a monopoly. So again, the advantage here is that it is simple and commonly used, but in terms of the disadvantages, it still doesn't consider the barriers to entry or the elasticity of demand. So that is it for this learning module. We're just going to have a look at the summary. So we talked about shutting down in the short run if the price is even lower than the average variable cost. But if variable cost is being covered but average total cost is not being covered, so we will operate in the short run, but in the long run we will shut down because fixed costs are variable in the long run. Then we talked about economies of scale, that we keep moving from the lower one to the lowest one until we reach this minimum efficient scale, and then from that point onwards bureaucracy starts to set in and other diseconomies of scale starts to set in and our cost goes up, and this is your long run average cost curve. Very, very important chart, this one. And a lot of exam questions can come from this chart, which tells us that perfect competition and monopolistic competition have many firms, but the difference is in the products, that there is some differentiation over here. And that's where the advertising and the differentiation comes in. Oligopoly, it could be same products or differentiated products, but the nature of the industry, because it has high barriers to entry, is what creates these few firms, and therefore now they are getting significant, some to significant pricing power. And then of course with a monopoly there is considerable pricing power, unique product, and very high barriers to entry. In terms of your monopolistic competition, we talked about the downward sloping demand curve, profit maximized at MC is equal to MR, and price being determined from the demand curve, whereas the supply function is not well defined in monopolistic competition. Your perfect competition, your MC is your supply curve. And we talked about oligopoly, some very, very interesting theories and models with the kinked demand curve, the Cournot assumption, the Nash equilibrium, and the dominant firm model, or also called the Stackelberg model. And we also talked about how for oligopolies the profit is maximized where MC is equal to MR. We looked at the dominant firm model, and even though the monopolistic competition supply function is not well defined, we did talk about the supply function of the monopolistic, of the dominant firm model, where we said that the dominant firm will choose their price and quantity and everybody else will have to follow, and the remaining firms are going to take the difference between the total quantity demanded and what the dominant firm will be supplying. In terms of the kinked demand curve, we talked about not increasing the price because a lot of reduction in quantity is there, and there's no point reducing the price because both players will lose. In terms of the dominant firm, we have to follow the leader's price. In the Cournot model, we have to price at MC is equal to MR, and no changes should be suggested at that point because it's going to obviously not lead to any increase in profitability in the long run. And for the Nash equilibrium, we said that each firm will do what's in its best interest until it gets to a point where nothing, no move can improve the profitability. The N firm concentration ratio, it is just a sum of the market shares of the largest firms. Easy to do, but ignores barriers to entry and does not measure market power directly or the elasticity of demand. However, this part, which is the market power part, can be solved by going for the HHI, where we take the squares and add them of the market shares of the n largest firms, and we get this very nice number which ranges between 0 and 1. So it is simple, commonly used by regulators, and does take care of the market power part, but it does not still take the barriers to entry or the elasticity of demand into account.